Good morning, everybody. I'll be presenting a case example of what the Peruvian government is actually trying to implement in Peru, and we'll see there has been mixed results, but I think it's a very interesting experience, particularly in the context of Latin America. And there's been a lot of interest from other governments within the region and outside of the region who've actually traveled to Peru to actually learn on this system, which is currently being implemented. So I'm just going to go through what government is doing. This is not what UNDP is doing. So first thing first, okay, Peru. Peru, during the last 10 years, has doubled its GDP per capita from $6,500 to almost $13,000. This means it has grown sustainably at a rate of 7% for the past 10 years. So obviously, this is very important in terms of framing a little bit our conversation. During 2004, investments in mining took place around $450 million that year. And in 2013, we were looking at $9 billion during 2013 alone. You can see the graph next to your side, and you can see this these trends in increasing of investments in mining sector. On average, it implies 58% of Peruvian exports, 14.5% of tax revenues, and 13% of GDP. That's the average between 2004 and 2014. So as you can imagine, this is very important for government in terms of putting forward social policies and promoting growth and reducing poverty, reducing inequalities, and so forth. So Peruvian government needs to sustain this type of growth. In terms of local development, the royalties or resource revenues generated basically by mining by itself is the largest source of revenues for decentralized public investments, impacting 1,724 districts out of 1,836 districts. So we're talking about almost 98% of districts, okay? And it has meant investments of over $5 billion. So at the local level, it has had a huge impact. In 2011, these royalties financed 11% of regional budgets, and in mining departments or mining regions, it financed equivalent to 20%. Transferred financed new infrastructure, prioritizing road infrastructure, water and sanitation, education infrastructure, and agricultural infrastructure. Today, the current investment portfolio is $56 billion, okay, which implies 47 large-scale mining projects throughout Peru. So as you can see, there's a big promise in terms of continuing with what is the sustained economic growth. However, there's several challenges for giving sustainability to this growth. First, that most of the mining projects are located in areas with large social gaps and extreme poverty. As you can see in the graph, the blue figure denotes the number of projects, okay, in that region, and this is the level of poverty, okay? So where we have most of the projects, there's high degrees of poverty. There's a weak presence of the state in several mining areas. There's limited impact on welfare because of these investments within communities. There's institutional weaknesses, basically because there's lack of representation mechanisms, and there's very little recognition of cultural diversity and environmental liabilities. So all these pose challenges, basically, to being able to sustain these investments. And these challenges basically have led to the emergence of social conflicts, which impact governance and stability, and has paralyzed and postponed investments. In terms of impacting governance and stability, for example, during the last 4 years, this has involved the removal of almost 4 ministers and other authorities. It has caused violent conflicts which have injured over 2,000 people and produced the deaths of 63 citizens. In terms of paralyzing, postponing investments, it has meant basically impeding an investment of $62 billion for the period 2011 to 2014, which overall impacted GDP growth by 2.3% per year. This means that if we would have been able to promote these investments, Peruvian economy would have grown 2.3% higher for every single year we're talking about. So, as you can imagine, it is of government's interest to maintain this growth, because this growth is what allows it to promote social policies and reduce investments. and promote investments. So, the evolution of social conflicts. We can see here that back in 2007, we were talking about 154 conflicts. In 2008, 216. 2009, 347. 2010, 362, and so forth. And in 2014, we had 11 conflicts. The period we're going to be talking about is particularly starting 2012, when we had a new government installed and promoted this new approach to addressing conflict, which was the institutionalization of dialogue. Currently, we have 211 social conflicts. Of all conflicts, 68% of these are linked to the use of natural resources. Particularly, 66% of the 68% are produced by mining challenges, 15% in hydrocarbons, and 8% in the use of energy. So as you can see, we have a very well thought out and detailed analysis of the type of conflicts we have in the country, and how these and what type of conflicts are affecting basically the country. So the new approach to address this issue was basically focus on prevention and the promotion of dialogue. What for? To improve governance for the country. This means more stability. To improve the sustainability of investments. This means we can sustain the rate of investments we want and hopefully increase it. And third, more development for the country. So what is this new approach based on? First, a focus on prevention. What government has done, it has tried to break down conflicts, okay? And we've noticed that we can break these conflicts in terms of differences and controversies to avoid the emergence of conflicts. Differences are when we understand that there's different perspectives in terms of an issue, and controversies is when these differences collide with each other but do not turn violent yet. So there's been a lot of work to identify where are these differences and where are these controversies. Once we identify them, government is able to act upon them. Second, management of dialogue. Government is now using dialogue as a main tool for the transformation of social tensions. What does this mean? A few years ago, say the government, before the actual government, government would simply take out the police, okay, and would use the force, and we would have confrontations, and there was very little room for basically a process where government, together with the communities, would try to sort of resolve the issues. This no longer happens. Today, government has decided that for every single conflict, they would install a commission or a dialogue process, where basically it's not only government and the community, but also the private sector and local governments. That's why we're talking about a multi-stakeholder dialogue. So from now on, whenever we talk about dialogue, we need to understand it's multi-stakeholder in nature. We need everybody involved in the conflict to sit down to try to resolve the differences. Thirdly, the building of new public policies. To be able to move forward with dialogue, we need to install this at the policy level. So therefore, there's been an implementation of strategies, instrument, methodologies, protocols, and policies per se for conflict prevention and management that are part of innovative public policies. I will go in deeper with on these in a few seconds. Fourth issue, the issue of citizen education. That means promoting a culture of peace, human rights, and democratic values that contribute to the generation of capacities for dialogue and mediation. In every single dialogue process, it is what proceeds before the actual sitting down to discuss the issues. There's also a process of training and capacitating social communities to better work with these issues. Fifth, research and analysis. There's systematization, analysis of information and research, which provides us with data that allows us to sort of take better decisions when addressing specific issues related to conflict. So there's a lot of analysis and data. Mrs. Arias mentioned in her presentation that in Peru, for example, we have the Ombudsman's Office, which has its own report. So it conducts an independent report on a monthly basis to pinpoint where are the main conflicts and what are those conflicts produced by, who are the main actors, what is the state of those conflicts, and so forth. The National Office for Dialogue and Sustainability, which was an institution recently created by the current government to coordinate dialogue processes within the country, also has its own research and has an early warning system, and it publishes a monthly study called the Uyakniki, okay, where it presents each one of the different conflicts that there are, who are the main players, and so forth. And the last issue is that of revamping local development process. So basically, through this dialogue, what we look at is what comes out of these processes are public-private commitments to increase social investments and increase delivery of public services. So at the end of the day, what is a result of these dialogue processes? We have a bigger presence of the state, we have more public services, and there's more investments, which are all planned and form part of a vision in terms of how to develop that territory. So in sum, we have a multi-stakeholder dialogue as an opportunity to enhance development, transforming conflicts into opportunities for development. So what is the implementation strategy for this? First, reestablish trust in government. So this has included basically boosting government presence by the establishment of consultation mechanisms. Peru is the first country to actually have a law on ILO's 169, okay, in Latin America. Furthermore, it has already taken steps to complete something like 22 prior consultation processes. Although not all of them are successful, we're still learning. Okay, the issue is there is a prior consultation process, and these are taking place. There's even a catalog within the Ministry of Culture that identifies who are the indigenous populations that are subject to be consulted in these processes. There's also a very strong commitment to strengthening environmental monitoring and supervision mechanisms. There's a few new institutions that have been created that are actually monitoring the activities of mining companies and of oil extractive companies as well. So this has created a lot more confidence in terms of population or communities towards the role of government. And of course, we're working towards a state architecture for the governance of natural resources, basically based on strengthening environmental issues, strengthening multicultural issues, strengthening social issues, and so forth. While this is in process and there's still a lot of work to be done, this is incipient, and these are the first steps towards this. There's also the interest of making a behavioral change of patterns between the state, companies, and society. The state, to promote investments and respect for citizen rights, articulate intervention of different government levels and sectors. That's one of the big things we've actually seen, which is also a cause of conflict. You have a conflict, you have different parts of the state that come to address a conflict. But nevertheless, that doesn't get us nowhere. Really quick. We have a national policy to institutionalize dialogue. There's a law proposal for the creation of a national system for the prevention and management of conflicts. We wanted to create the Center of Excellence for Good Entrepreneurial Practices and an Institute for Dialogue and Consensus that would bring together the state, private sector, and communities in order to advance the issue of dialogue. There's new strategy tools, which are dialogue spaces, early warning mechanisms, training models for capacity development, communication networks, participation, consultation mechanisms, and so forth. And there are the dialogue spaces, which are called development roundtables, dialogue roundtables, and so forth. So what are the key results, very quickly? One, dialogue is government's primary strategy to address conflicts. Today, basically, government is present in almost all of the conflicts, and all of the conflicts have ongoing dialogue processes going. This has definitely led to strengthen the credibility and trust in the state. There's new methodologies to promote this approach, and there's been a radical drop in the number and intensity of conflicts. As you can see in the following graphs, these represent the conflicts that have been managed, that have been solved. 136 conflicts have been solved during the past 4 years. These are the cases in treatment where government is actually pursuing the work in conflict. And there you can see the number of dialogue spaces that have been created in order to advance this. And 5, there's an increased government spending for local development process. During 2013 alone, more than $600 million of government funds were put into these areas where these conflicts were taking place. Okay, so there's a strong linkage between conflicts and development. Development diffuses conflicts. So how do we bring development together? It's not only about bringing government on board, but it's also having the private sector, and it's also about having local governments on board. Quickly, challenges. Political will is critical to moving forward the institutionalization of dialogue. Commodity prices and impact over royalties represent today a risk for an increase of conflicts. As we know, prices have gone down. That means that there's less royalties, and that means that there's less money to be able to spend. Missed opportunities. We haven't been able to implement the national system. So far, this is still a law, and hopefully will be passed in the next 2 months. There's also an issue of contradicting public policies. For example, the role of the Ministry of Energy and Mines, that while it has a role to promote investments, it also tries to supervise what are the role, what are the environmental standards these investments are taking, and it also tries to apply conflict prevention mechanisms. So you have one organization doing everything, and this organization has been colliding with government's efforts to promote a strategy for dialogue and sustainability. I think that consumes my time, correct? I'm sorry, I took a little longer. So yes, so this is basically a little bit how the Peruvian system works. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Maybe we'll just stop right here. That's about 6 questions, so we could get some responses. As I'm conscious of the time, if anything, we're going to have to discuss some of these issues over lunch, because it is really fascinating, and we've just started. So here, I better turn the mic over.
I'll go quickly through some of the questions on the local development side asked by our colleague. Basically, main thing is, the issue is, through these dialogue process, we get government engaged, we get private sector engaged, we get communities engaged, we get local governments engaged, and they all work towards developing a vision. And that vision usually responds to the priorities set within the local development plans of the municipality. So the issue is, independent of you private sector, what you want to do, the idea is what you do, the funds you put, for example, or for social programs, they are part of the wider perspective and vision of the development process. So you're not doing it separately, you're just adding to something that is part of a consensus. Not always works, but that is the idea behind it, and it has been achieved in several cases. Regarding the transparency vis-a-vis conflict, I cannot speak for Angola. I'm on the other side of the world. But in the case of Peru, yes, El MIMP is very interesting, carried out by the AFC. But the MIMP, I think, responds a little more to how do we strengthen capacities of local mayors to invest better. Okay, and I think that one of the key challenges in this process, where transparency indeed is very important, is how do we plan better the resources we have? Because I mean, we do know, yes, we need to strengthen capacities, maybe this might be better, etc. But the issue is that at the end of the day, the plans of a major not necessarily reflect basically the general consensus of the population of where do we want to set the development process. So although there is participatory planning processes, these participatory planning processes fail to be participatory and therefore do not reflect what the main priorities are. So that's also a gap that is not being addressed, and that dialogue tables or development tables, as they are also called, tries to address very limited, because at the end of the day, they all agree on 5 projects, for example, 5 major projects, okay, that's going to improve the situation of people, but these projects don't talk to each other. You know, they're not envisioned in terms of how do they strengthen human development from a territorial perspective, but more from a sectorial perspective. So that is a big thing. And a final comment on the issue, on the question of Rebecca. What UNDP has done to support the approach is basically strengthening the capacity of the state to implement this approach, translating it
in terms of helping regional governments and other actors of the state to align itself to this approach, strengthen coordination mechanisms between the different ministries, because it's not one ministry doing this. We have 10 conflict prevention and dialogue offices within the government. So it's how do we enhance coordination, empowering civil society. Civil society plays a humongous role in terms of moving forward dialogue, and it's basically one of the big bases in terms of ensuring that this approach can follow. And finally, we're definitely working very closely with the private sector, and we have a private sector that I think understands the issues finally, at least a big part of private sector, and that is definitely a major asset in terms of moving these things forward.